Elias was not like the other children of Ashbourne. His brothers and sisters chuckled and played in the area as they yelled and chased one another through the grass. But Elias meandered alone. He favored the calm corners of the farmhouse, or the dim ways along the field where the fog twisted like fretful spirits. The townsfolk regularly said that Elias looked as in spite of the fact that he had been born from the mist itself. Pale, calm, and bizarre, he had eyes that waited as well long, and a nearness that felt more seasoned than his years. The Finch family attempted to treat him as they treated their other children. However, they may not disregard the contrast. Elias barely cried when he was a child. He would gaze at the wooden bars of the ceiling, as in spite of the fact that he caught on the structure of the world itself. Sometime recently, he had words his mother frequently woke at night to discover him sitting upright in the support, observing the moon through the broken glass window. His father would mumble that the boy was odd, but safe. Still, a whisper of unease had as of now settled in their family, and it developed with each passing year. By the time Elias was 5, the weirdness may no longer be expelled. Lights flashed when he entered a room. Candles burned lower or flared brighter without any touch. Clocks close him ticked gradually, and in some cases ceased. Through and through, the Finch guardians told themselves it was coincidence. They told the neighbors nothing but whispers moved rapidly through Ashbourne, a town where chatter spread quicker than smoke from the coal pits, and the title Elias Finch was continuously talked with, brought down voices. A few dreaded witchcraft. Others accepted he was reviled, and a few thought he was a supernatural occurrence, in spite of the fact that no one challenged to say so aloud. The fields around Ashbourne were as of now places of superstition. Travelers claimed to see unusual lights in the mist, and to listen voices calling them by title presently. With Elias developing up in the Finch farmhouse, the fields appeared indeed more frequented. Villagers said they saw the boy strolling alone in the areas at night, indeed in winter when the ice bit the discuss and no child ought to have been exterior. He would stand beneath the moon, his pale hair glimmering faintly, and the mist would twist around him as if it complied his noiseless command. His guardians dreaded for him, but they dreaded more for themselves. They knew what the church might say if the rumors developed as well uproarious, so they attempted to keep him covered up. They sent his more seasoned kin to town for supplies, whereas Elias remained behind. But no matter how carefully they protected him, stories continuously found their way to the ears of untouchables, and in time a man of science came to Ashbourne. His title was Dr. Aldous Harrington, a doctor and normal rationalist who had listened rumors of a boy who bowed the world around him. Dr. Harrington was not a man of confidence. He accepted in rational estimation and the control of reason he arrived at the Finch, domestic with rebellious brass compasses, glass thermometers, magnets, and lights. He anticipated to discover nothing more than an overactive creative ability from the villagers. But when he stood in the same room as Elias, his certainty started to tremble. The compass needle spun in circles, denying to rest. The glass of water he put on the table undulated in spite of the fact that no wind blew. His thermometer split with a sharp sound, as if incapable to degree the boy who sat calmly observing him with unblinking eyes. The specialist returned once more, and once more decided to reveal the truth. He tried Elias in each way he seemed, but the boy never stood up to. He sat in hush now and then, touching the objects, in some cases overlooking them, through and through. However, each time Harrington cleared out the farmhouse, he carried more questions than answers. He composed notes that developed more unhinged with each visit, calling Elias an inconsistency, a disturbance of common law, and maybe something not of this earth. Meanwhile, Elias himself developed gradually. His kin developed tall and solid. However, he remained little, lean, and pale. At the age of 7, he still looked no more seasoned than 4. His hair never obscured his skin, never tanned indeed beneath the summer sun. It was as in spite of the fact that time itself denied to touch him. He once in a while fell sick, and when he scratched his skin, whereas meandering the fields, the wound closed inside a day, taking off no scar. His brothers and sisters whispered of him in fear, and his guardians supplicated harder with each season that passed. The town of Ashbourne got to be fretful. Whispers turned to fear. Villagers crossed themselves when they passed the Finch cultivate. Children challenged each other to run close the entryway, in spite of the fact that few were courageous sufficient, and those who did swore they felt the disgust develop overwhelming. Around the house, the cleric cautioned the family to keep confidence, in spite of the fact that his voice shook when Elias strolled into the chapel with his pale eyes lifted toward the altar, one harvest time night when the wind cried through the chimneys. Elias collapsed in the farmhouse. His little body shuddered. Brutally, his eyes rolled back and his lips whispered words that chilled his guardians to the bone. He said, "They need me back sometime recently," falling into hush. No one seemed clarify what he implied. Specialists from town were called, but none might discover cause for his ailment. They cleared out, murmuring of riddles they would not set out to name. The storm that taken after was not at all like any in living memory. Thunder broke in the skies open and lightning tore over the fields in blinding white streaks. Elias rose from his bed, calm once more, his eyes sparkling unnaturally. He strolled to the farmhouse entryway, and his guardians clung to him, asking him not to take off. But he, as it were, turned and gave them a last look exterior. The wind circled unnaturally, shaping a winding that drew the haze upward. Villagers afterward swore they saw a column of light brighter than the sun standing upon the Finch land. In one last streak, Elias was gone. No body, no follow as it were burned, soil where he had stood. The storm ceased as abruptly as it had started, and hush heavier than ever fell upon Ashbourne. Dr. Harrington went through the rest of his life composing approximately the boy. No one accepted him. The Regal Society rejected his papers. His colleagues derided him, but he never abnegated. He called Elias Finch the boy science may not clarify, and he passed on with that puzzle still burning in his intellect. The Finch farmhouse was surrendered. The family moved absent, incapable to bear the recollections, and the individuals of Ashbourne cleared out it to decay. Children developed up, hearing the story, brave one another to walk past the destroyed dividers, where clocks still ceased and lights still glinted, as if the boy waited in the discus holding up unseen. And so the legend of Elias Finch lived on, whispered in the mist of the fields, a story of a child born in 1871 who opposed science, resisted confidence, and maybe had a place not to Ashbourne nor to Britain, nor to the world at all, but to something distant past. Elias Finch was born amid an electrical storm when the birthing specialist swore she saw the lights glint and listened whispers in the discus. In spite of the fact that no one else seemed affirm his birth was troublesome, however, he survived more grounded than anticipated in the, to begin with, a long time. He barely cried, barely talked, and however his eyes carried a brightness that unsettled indeed his guardians. The storm exterior that night was not like any standard storm, for the clouds appeared lively with fire, and the rain fell so intensely that the farmhouse roof trembled with each strike. The Finch family recollected that night for the rest of their lives, since the minute Elias came into the world, the thunder split so boisterously it shook the bed frame, and the birthing specialist panted that she had seen shadows move over the dividers indeed, in spite of the fact that no one else saw them. She demanded, she listened, voices whispering words. She might not get it. Words carried by the wind that made her hands tremble as she held the infant child. His mother, pale and depleted, clutched him to her chest, and for a short-lived moment she thought the boy's eyes shined with the unusual light. But she told no one for fear they would call her frantic. His father, standing at the window, observing the rain pelt against the glass, murmured that the storm had stamped the boy. that he would be not at all like the others, but no one really caught on what that implied. Not at that point, not in those early hours when the family's help that the child had survived exceeded the unease that unobtrusively settled in their hearts. From the exceptionally starting Elias appeared abnormally strong in spite of the fact that his birth had been troublesome. His modest body held on with quality that astounded the birthing specialist, who had seen incalculable newborn children come up short to take their to begin with breath. Elias not, as it were, survived but developed consistently, in spite of the fact that in ways that were not like other children he once in a while cried. His mother would frequently rise at night, anticipating to listen, him moan as it were, to discover him lying wide looked at in his support, as in spite of the fact that he were examining the shadows on the ceiling with a calm that no newborn child ought to have had. Some of the time she would capture him, looking out the window as the moonlight touched his confront, and the hush of those minutes alarmed her more than any cry ever could. The neighbors who came to visit praised the Finch family on their unused child. But indeed they felt something impossible to miss in the discuss when they inclined over the support. The candles would vacillate, as if a draft had slipped into the room in spite of the fact that all the windows were closed. One neighbor swore that the fire bowed absent from the child as if in fear, in spite of the fact that she said it as it were once and never once more, for she did not wish to be thought unkind to the Finches. Still, such little things built gradually into unease, and by the time Elias was a year ancient, the family had started to whisper to themselves that he was different. When most children of his age jabbered and giggled, Elias remained quiet. He would observe his guardians with those clear eyes, as in spite of the fact that he caught on distant more than he may express, when his kin played with wooden toys, Elias overlooked them, inclining toward instep to sit discreetly following designs on the floorboards with his fingers. He did not reach out for consolation nor object when he was cleared out alone. Or maybe it appeared that the house itself reacted to his dispositions when he developed eager. The ancient wooden pillars moaned as, in spite of the fact that moving beneath inconspicuous weight when he appeared substance. The flashing oil lights burned relentless and bright. By his moment year, the unusual quality developed, for whereas other little children lurched clumsily on insecure legs, Elias moved with ghostly beauty. His steps were delicate, his adjust as well. Beyond any doubt, his mother once found him standing in the obscured passage long after the family had gone to bed. His eyes settled on the distant conclusion of the hallway, as in spite of the fact that something inconspicuous had called him there. When she took him back to his bed, he did not stand up to. He simply turned his head once more toward the haziness. Sometime recently, closing his eyes, his father started to talk less of the boy and more of the cultivate work, as if hush may camouflage his unease. However, indeed, he might not deny that Elias unsettled him one evening, whereas repairing devices by lamplight. He looked up to discover Elias sitting unobtrusively over the room. The apparatuses in his hand trembled, for he swore the light fire darkened when the boy looked at it. And for a minute the shadows around him protracted unnaturally. He mumbled a supplication beneath his breath, and told his spouse they must take the boy to church more often. But Elias did not take to church as other children did. When the family sat in the seats, he sat still and noiseless, his eyes meandering to the recolored glass, as in spite of the fact that he saw something moving behind it. The cleric gave him gifts, however conceded secretly to the guardians that he felt a weight in the discuss when the boy was close. Not fiendish maybe, but unnatural. Like standing as well near to a storm, the Finch guardians gestured courteously, but fear developed unobtrusively in their hearts. By the time Elias was 3, the birthing assistant who had conveyed him confessed to the nearby doctor that she seemed not halt considering of the night of his birth. She said that she still listened. The whispers in her dreams, voices talking words, she seemed not get it. And each time she saw Elias, Those recollections returned more honed and heavier. The doctor expelled her stresses with giggling, but when he met the boy himself a year afterward, he as well found his certainty shaken. What unsettled his guardians most of all was the way Elias looked at individuals. He would sit quietly observing, as if examining them, with the information distant past his. A long-time children his age chuckled and clapped and come to for toys. Elias, as it were, observed as in spite of the fact that holding up for something to happen, there was a brightness in his look. Not the brightness of delight but of mindfulness. It was as if he carried in his little delicate body a start of something that did not have a place totally to the human world. The Finch guardians started to fear their claim child, in spite of the fact that they adored him in the way guardians must cherish their children. They might not shake the sense that he was stamped by something more prominent than them, something that might one day take him absent. They recalled the storm of his birth, the glinting lights, the whispers in the discuss, and they pondered if maybe the boy had been given to them, as it were, for a time, borrowed from powers they challenged not name. As Elias developed more seasoned, the oddness did not blur. It developed each year, his hush developed heavier, his eyes more honed, and the world around him appeared to twist unobtrusively, in ways no one may agree. And in spite of the fact that the Finch family attempted to live as if he were standard, they all knew profound interior that the night of his birth had changed more than their family. It had brought into Ashbourne a nearness the town would never disregard. By the time Elias turned 5, peculiarities encompassed him. Fowls would assemble on the windowsill without fear of predators. Lights darkened. When he entered a room, clocks ticked slower around him and in some cases ceased through and through. The Finch guardians supplicated at church and whispered at domestic pondering if their child was touched by something unholy or skilled past comprehension. As the long time passed, the oddness of Elias got to be inconceivable to disregard. His kin, who once attempted to incorporate him in their diversions, started to take off him behind, for he unsettled them in ways they may not clarify. When they played in the areas, giggling and running openly, Elias would basically stand at the edge, his pale hair catching the daylight. His eyes bolted, not on the children but on the skyline, as if he saw something that no one else may see. The fowls that assembled close the Finch farmhouse appeared drawn to him in specific: sparrows, crows, and indeed, pigeons would sit along the windowsill. Their beady eyes settled upon the boy, whereas he sat still on the wooden floorboards. Now and then the fowls would stay for hours, rippling their wings delicately but never flying absent, until Elias at long last turned his look somewhere else. His mother started to cover the windows with cloth, for the locate terrified her, and she dreaded that neighbors might take note. However, no matter how numerous times she attempted to drive the animals off, they continuously returned at whatever point Elias was near. Inside the house, the lights got to be untrustworthy. At whatever point Elias entered a room, the oil flares darkened and glinted, as in spite of the fact that a few inconspicuous wind passed through. Indeed, when the windows were closed firmly, some of the time the fire would disappear, totally diving the room into obscurity, until Elias cleared out once more, and at that point the fire would return on its possess. His father murmured that it was awful oil or defective lights, but profound interior. He knew the truth. No clarification of devices or materials might clarify what he witnessed. Even the clocks of the Finch family endured in Elias's nearness, the relentless tick-tock that guided the beat of cultivate life, vacillated when he drew close. To begin with, they would moderate by a moment or two. At that point, halt through and through, as it were, to start once more. When Elias moved absent, the family endeavored to cover up this from guests. But one evening, a neighbor commented that her take observe halted, whereas she talked to the boy. She giggled anxiously, calling it a coincidence. But her eyes waited with doubt, and from that day she seldom gone by the farmhouse. Again, his guardians battled with the weight of what their child was getting to be. They supplicated in church each Sunday, stooping at the holy place with overwhelming hearts. Their whispers filled the night after the children had gone to bed. They wrangled about whether Elias was a favoring or a revile. His mother accepted. He was a blessing sent from paradise to test their confidence. His father dreaded he was a sign of something darker and past their understanding. However, not one or the other challenged talk, such contemplations out loud in the nearness of the cleric. For the simple recommendation may have condemned the boy in the eyes of the village. Though Elias once in a while talked, his hush carried control. When he did talk, his words came delicate and moderate, but with an odd clarity that startled those who tuned in once when his sister scratched her knee and cried. He touched her arm and whispered that it would not harmed long by morning the wound had recuperated, nearly totally, with no check cleared out behind his mother, fell to her knees in supplication saying thanks to God. Whereas his father turned pale, incapable to shake the thought that such mending did not have a place to conventional substance and blood. The children of Ashbourne whispered stories approximately Elias behind their guardians' backs. A few said, he seemed command. The creature's others swore he strolled the areas at night and the mist bowed around him, as in spite of the fact that lively one boy claimed that Elias gazed at him once over the churchyard and his take observed split. The children chuckled anxiously as they told these stories, but none challenged play. Close the Finch arrived for long as fear weighed heavier than curiosity. Dr. Aldous Harrington. The doctor, who had to begin with taken intrigued in the boy, listened to unused rumors of Elias and returned to the Finch domestic with more disobedient, decided to get it. The irregularity he brought compasses which spun fiercely in the boy's nearness. He brought magnets that bent from his control. He set up lights and crystals, as it were, to observe light twist in unnatural curves, as in spite of the fact that Elias's exceptionally being irritated the laws of the physical world, Harrington developed more intrigued and more unsettled with each test. The boy never stood up to. He just sat calm and careful, as in spite of the fact that he, as of now, knew what Harrington would discover. The cleric of Ashbourne as well got to be disturbed in spite of the fact that he had counseled the family to hold quick to confidence. He confessed secretly to his diary that the boy's nearness filled him with fear. Amid one sermon, Elias sat in the seats with his family, and in spite of the fact that the church was filled with warmth from the candles, a sudden chill ran through the nave. The cleric lurched over his words, looking anxiously at the child who sat still as stone with unblinking eyes. He composed afterward that he felt, as in spite of the fact that the boy had been sent as a test, not as it were to the Finch family, but to the whole town, at domestic. The Finch guardians lived in steady unease. However, they cherished their child in spite of their fear. His mother regularly brushed his pale hair back from his confront and kissed his temple, whispering supplications against the weirdness that encompassed him. His father worked longer hours in the areas, dodging the calm minutes when Elias would show up quietly at his side to observe the plow cut through the soil, never inquiring questions, never making a sound. Fair, observing with a look that felt distant, more seasoned than his years. When storms passed over Ashbourne, the family developed. More frightful for Elias appeared to develop eager. Amid those evenings he would sit at the window observing the lightning part. The sky, his eyes reflecting the flashes of white, as in spite of the fact that they had a place to him some of the time. The thunder would shake the dividers. However, Elias remained unaffected, as calm as the winged creatures that roosted exterior observing him. As if he were the center of all storms, his mother regularly clutched her rosary amid such evenings, asking out loud, whereas her spouse gazed at the boy with quiet dread. By his 5th birthday, Elias had gotten to be both the most prominent secret and the most noteworthy burden of the Finch family. His presence filled their lives with fear and wonderment. In break-even with degree, they may not get at him. However, they might not deny him. They implored for answers, but none came, and so they lived, caught between dedication and dread, raising a child who appeared to have a place as much to the world past as to the world they knew. The town proceeded to whisper, and in spite of the fact that no one gone up against the Finches specifically, the weight of doubt developed heavier. With each passing day, the individuals of Ashbourne dodged the farmhouse. The priest's sermons developed more critical, and Dr. Harrington filled page after page with perceptions that resisted the rationale of science. And at the center of it all sat Elias Finch, a boy of 5, a long-time ancient, who did not giggle, who did not cry, who did not play, and however, who appeared to twist the exceptionally arrange of nature with his noiseless presence. And so the Finch family carried on, uncertain of whether their child was a wonder or a revile, incapable to turn absent, however anxious to see as well closely at what he genuinely was, the boy who drew feathered creatures to his window, the boy who hushed clocks, the boy who unsettled the discus around him, a boy touched by something unholy or skilled past comprehension, a boy who might not be clarified. Word of the bizarre child spread until a traveling doctor and beginner researcher, Dr. Aldous Harrington, asked to see him. Harrington recorded each development, each signal. But the more he considered the boy, the more unsettled he got to be the rebellious. He brought with him wavered thermometers broken, and his compass needle spun perpetually in Elias' nearness. Science had no words for what it seen. The to begin with whispers of the Finch boy had carried past Ashbourne, carried by shippers who ceased at the bar, by pioneers who passed through on their way to bigger towns, and by agriculturists who exchanged their merchandise at adjacent markets. The story developed, with each telling a few claimed, Elias may recuperate with a touch, others swore. He was taken after by feathered creatures, or that the haze bowed at his command. And in spite of the fact that most expelled these stories as superstition, they were interesting sufficient to draw the consideration of Dr. Aldous Harrington, a man known for his interest and his tenacious look for wonders that resisted common understanding. Harrington arrived in Ashbourne with the discuss of one sure in science. He wore a overwhelming coat against the chill and carried with him boxes of disobedient brass compasses amplifying focal points, thermometers, and indeed little gadgets of his possessed development. He had examined climate designs, geography, the developments of firmament bodies, and incalculable peculiarities of nature, and he accepted, immovably, that each puzzle might be diminished to reason if watched, long sufficient and carefully sufficient. When he thumped on the weathered entryway of the Finch farmhouse, he anticipated to discover misrepresentations born of fear, nothing more, yet. When the entryway opened and he ventured interior, he felt the weight of hush overwhelming as stone. The boy sat close the window, pale eyes looking outward, as in spite of the fact that the entry of the stranger mattered small to him. Harrington presented himself with practiced courteousness, but Elias advertised no answer. He, as it were, turned his look toward the doctor, and in that minute Harrington felt something blend profound in his chest, a sudden move in the discuss, as in spite of the fact that the room itself had taken note his entry. The feeling unsettled him in spite of the fact that he squeezed on for men of science, or not to be shaken by quiet or atmosphere. He said approximately his work with exactness, laying out his rebellious upon the table. He started with straightforward tests, watching the child's breathing, his beat, his responses to light and sound. But the comes about gave him no fulfillment, for Elias did not react as other children would. He did not startle at sudden clamor. His beat was relentless indeed beneath the gleam of a shinning light, his skin pale but unblemished, his eyes calm, however overwhelming with unmindfulness. Harrington seemed not title the doctor written notes in his record. commenting that the boy was curiously calm, abnormally strong, abnormally careful. Still, he persuaded himself that these were just characteristics, not anomalies. It was when he brought forward his rebellious that the genuine oddness started the compass. Needle spun without conclusion, denying to point north in spite of the fact that Harrington tried it once more, and once more the thermometer split without reason. The mercury rising and falling whimsically sometime recently. The glass smashed, spilling its substance over the wooden table. The lights diminished in spite of the fact that their wicks were solid and their oil crisply filled. Harrington inclined near altering and recalibrating. However, the more he attempted, the less sense the comes-about made. The boy did not move through all of this. He, as it were, sat still. His eyes settled on Harrington as if considering him, or maybe then being examined. It was not the look of a child, but of something more seasoned, colder, something that knew more than the man with all his books and apparatuses. Harrington felt a chill crawl into his spine. But he squeezed on, denying to concede vanquish. He told himself that natural variables may clarify the unsettling influences. Maybe the farmhouse carried inconspicuous drafts. Maybe the rebellious were flawed. Maybe his weariness from travel made him careless. But in his heart, he knew the truth. Science was faltering. Each day he returned trusting to capture a repeatable design. However, each test finished in disappointment. The magnets turned brutally in bearings that made no sense. His pendulum denied to swing in a relentless circular segment. Light bowed unusually when put close. Elias, as in spite of the fact that imperceptible, hands pulled at the beams when Harrington endeavored to degree the boy's body temperature. The thermometer burst sometime recently, enlisting anything at all. It was as if Elias existed fair, past the reach of characteristic law, untouched by the standards that administered each other. Living being, Harrington's notes developed unhinged, filled with lines and lines of fizzled estimations written with shaking hands. He depicted the boy as an irregularity not at all like any he had experienced. Sometime recently, not one or the other wiped out, nor totally well, not one or the other. Delicate nor solid, not one or the other. Child nor man, his words carried both wonder and fear. He conceded that he had felt a largeness in the discuss when Elias looked straightforwardly at him, a greatness that made his contemplations waver, as in spite of the fact that the boy's nearness bowed not as it were physical rebellious, but the exceptionally workings of the mind, the Finch guardians observed. All of this with calm fear they had trusted. The specialist might offer clarifications, maybe indeed a remedy, but as the days passed it got to be clear that he had none. Instead he developed more unsettled, more questionable, his voice tight when he talked to them of common wonders. However, his eyes deceived his incredulity. He encouraged them to keep the boy absent from prying eyes to ensure him from a world that would not get it. However, it was clear Harrington himself did not get it either. When Harrington at long last cleared out Ashbourne, he carried with him a travel bag of broken disobedient and an intellect torn between reason and fear. He told no one in town of what he had seen, for he dreaded to ride from his peers however he may not take off the matter behind. He returned to his domestic and filled notepad after notepad with accounts of the boy, each test, each disappointment, each sensation he had felt. Whereas in his nearness he composed that Elias Finch spoken to the limits of science, the edge of information, the point at which human reason fizzled to get a handle on the truth. But indeed, as he composed, Harrington knew that he would return, for he might not bear to take off the puzzle unsolved. The boy who smashed glass without touch, who halted clocks with his closeness, who gazed with eyes that appeared to hold whole storms inside them. Elias was no insignificant interest. He was something more, something that whispered of universes, inconspicuous and strengths. Unmeasured science had no words for what it had seen, and Harrington both dreaded and yearned to reveal what lay past that hush. At 7, Elias still looked no more seasoned than 4. His body appeared to stand up to time. He once in a while fell sick. His skin recuperated from scratches overnight, whereas other children faltered through development spurts. Elias remained, a sensitive, pale figure, continuously observing, never joining, however, continuously tuning in, as if he caught on more than his quiet uncovered. His little outline unsettled the Finch family, for in spite of the fact that a long time past, his appearance scarcely changed. His kin developed taller, their voices moving from childhood tones into the unbalanced pitches of youth. Their appendages stretched, their faces modified with the marks of developing. However, Elias remained suspended as. In spite of the fact that time had overlooked him, the family seemed not disregard what their eyes told them, and in spite of the fact that they attempted to treat him as they did their other children, the contrast got to be outlandish to disguise the chew. Neighbors started to take note as well. When guests came to the farmhouse, they would look at Elias with confused eyes, whispering to his guardians that he was strikingly little for his age. The Finch family constrained neighborly grins and clarified that he had continuously been fragile. But their voices trembled with unease, for they knew this was not slightness. It was something else, something more profound. His mother implored each night that his development would come all at once, like a postponed favoring. However, each morning he rose from his bed the same as sometime recently, pale, lean, untouched by the entry of days. Despite his delicate appearance, Elias never endured the ailments that tormented his kin when hacks spread through the school building. When fevers struck the children of Ashbourne, Elias remained untouched. No shudder, no sweat, no shortcoming. His skin shined faintly with well-being. Indeed, as the others moaned in bed, his mother marveled at this, to begin with, taking it as a sign of divine security. But her wonder turned to fear when she realized that his well-being was not characteristic. His wounds as well recuperated unnaturally quick. A cut over his palm, closed overnight without scar, a bruise blurred. Sometime recently, the morning sun rose. His father once saw him drop against the stones by the horse shelter, skin tearing over his knee. But by the another evening, the substance was entirety, as if the harm had never been. Other children in town bumbled through the unbalanced a long time of development, their bodies as well, expansive for their quality, their giggling uproarious and clumsy, their play filled with falls and tears. Elias did not lurch. His adjust remained, idealize his steps, as well, cautious his developments as well, agile for a child his age, whereas the others tumbled like foals learning their legs. Elias floated through rooms like a shadow as well, light to exasperate the discuss as well, noiseless to be listened. His kin in some cases attempted to drag him into their diversions. They encouraged him to run with them in the areas, to chase the sheep, to roll in the grass. However, he, as it were, strolled nearby, them never joining, never giggling in step. He tuned in, as in spite of the fact that the cadence of their voices and the rise of their breath mattered more than the recreations themselves. His tuning in unsettled them more than his hush, for he appeared to capture each word talked, indeed those whispered. When they thought he was not close, once his sister whispered approximately him, saying she dreaded he was not really human. And in spite of the fact that Elias stood over the room without moving, he turned his head and rehashed her words in a voice, calm and relentless. She fled the room sobbing, startled by the thought that he had listened through separate and quiet alike. His brothers as well developed watchful. They prodded him less. They maintained a strategic distance from his look, for his eyes did not sparkle with the blamelessness of youth. They glimmered with mindfulness, as in spite of the fact that each look punctured through to the marrow. The guardians lived in torment, torn between fear and commitment. His mother clung to the trust that Elias was touched by a few divine elegance, that he was kept little and unusual, since paradise had stamped him for enormity. His father might not calm The darker thought that the boy was unnatural, that he had been reviled since the night of the rainstorm birth. When whispers filled the discuss, their contentions were quieted, but Elias continuously appeared to listen them. He would sit in the shadows, noiseless, his confront garbled, and when his mother sobbed, he would put a hand upon hers, not with childish warmth, but with the calm weight of one who caught on distress, distant as well. Well, the town of Ashbourne proceeded to mumble their stories, developed darker with each season. A few said Elias had been born, as of now dead, and by one means or another risen once more. Others said he had been traded at birth, a changeling cleared out and put of a human child, by powers that moved concealed. A few challenged call him a marvel, but most crossed themselves when they passed him, for they may not acknowledge a boy who did not develop, who did not lurch, who did not come up short like all others in the world. Harrington returned at interims, his interest honed by each report he had trusted time would demonstrate Elias to be conventional. That age would claim him like any other child. But when he saw the boy unaltered, his doubts developed. Harrington inspected him once more, bringing more exact rebellious made by gifted hands. However, the comes about were the same. The compass needles spun, the magnets turned, and the boy sat noiselessly observing his skin smooth his body. Unaltered, Harrington written notes in fevered flurry, depicting Elias as a disturbance of characteristic law. His development suspended, his wounds eradicated, his well-being absolute. The cleric as well battled in his heart. He conveyed sermons around confidence, trials, and divine secrets. But when Elias sat in the seats, the cleric found his tongue overwhelming, words faltered from his lips, and cold sweat accumulated upon his forehead. Once Elias raised his eyes toward the recolored glass, and for a minute the colored light broken abnormally over the nave, as in spite of the fact that, bowing unnaturally toward the boy, the assembly moved anxiously in their seats, a few whispering that the boy was stamped by paradise, others whispering darker things. For Elias himself, none of this appeared to matter. He remained careful, noiseless, and quiet, as in spite of the fact that his little shape contained an understanding he may not, however, uncover. He did not complain. He did not request. He basically existed unobtrusively in their world, however continuously separated from it, as if he had a place to another put entirely. His guardians implored harder each night. His kin maintained a strategic distance from him. The villagers whispered, the specialist written wild-eyed notes, and the cleric dreaded his possess words. But Elias remained unaltered, unaltered in body, unaltered in soul. A sensitive pale figure, continuously observing, never joining, however continuously tuning in, carrying in his quiet the weight of something tremendous and mysterious. Rumors started to thicken. Villagers whispered approximately witchcraft, curses, and unnatural blood. They dodged the Finch cultivate. A few claimed to see Elias strolling the areas at night with the moonlight twisting unnaturally around him. The cleric talked cautiously, encouraging the Finches to keep confidence, but his eyes sold out fear. When Elias strolled into the chapel, the whispers in Ashbourne developed louder with each passing season. As Elias remained little pale and unaltered, his hush and weirdness no longer something the townsfolk may disregard in a put where superstition lived nearby. Confidence, each peculiarity got to be fuel for doubt, and the boy at the edge of town got to be the heart of each quieted conversation. It started with looks. When villagers saw him walk with his mother to the advertise, they turned away, their eyes crossing themselves or mumbling beneath their breath. A few said his nearness made the disgust develop overwhelming, that the ground appeared colder where his feet had touched. Moms drew their children absent, pulling their hands strongly when inquisitive eyes waited as well. Long at that point, the stories started to spread, stories formed by fear and creative energy, until no one might tell truth from invention. One rancher swore he had seen Elias standing in the field long after midnight, his little figure surrounded by the silver gleam of the moon, the haze assembled thick around him. However, the boy stood clear and sharp, as in spite of the fact that the fog itself separated to uncover him. Another lady claimed she saw the moonlight twist unnaturally moving, as in spite of the fact that it bowed toward Elias, wrapping him in a gleam that appeared unearthly. She told the story, trembling, over her mug at the bar, and by morning half the town whispered of it as fact. Some whispered of witchcraft, others of curses. They reviewed the storm the night of his birth, the lightning that shook the farmhouse, the interesting glints of light that had taken after his early, a long time, and they said it seemed be nothing common, nothing sacred. There were darker voices as well, who whispered that his blood was not human, that his family had been checked eras back, and that Elias was the natural product of that covered-up debasement in spite of the fact that no proof existed. The story spread like rapidly spreading fire through a dry field. The Finch cultivate got to be a put of evasion once neighbors had ceased by to share bread or borrow apparatuses presently. The way to the farmhouse lay purge weeds inching along its edges. No children challenged play close the arrive. Those who passed by talked of the crows that waited on the fence posts, observing with unblinking dark eyes. A few claimed that when Elias looked at those crows, they moved upon the wood, as in spite of the fact that recognizing his look, as in spite of the fact that they recognized him not as a boy, but as something higher or darker. Inside the Finch family, the family lived in separation, torn by fear of the exterior and fear of their claim. Child, the mother still clung to supplication, whispering that Elias was a trial sent from paradise, a child set separated for divine reason. She clutched her rosary more tightly each time the villagers murmured curses behind her back. However, her confidence shook in the calm of night when she saw her child standing still at the window, observing the moon as if talking with something inconspicuous. The father developed more solidified, his quiet, profound, his eyes shadowed. He worked the areas with anxious vitality, maintaining a strategic distance from his son's look in spite of the fact that he may never elude the weight of it. When Elias entered the chapel, the discus appeared to move indeed. The cleric may not camouflage his unease in spite of the fact that his words called for sympathy and confidence. His eyes sold out him, trembling somewhat as he observed the pale boy walk gradually through the path. The candles flashed in spite of the fact that no breeze entered the room. The assembly mumbled apprehensively, a few bowing their heads rapidly, as if anxious to meet his eyes, others sneaking looks as in spite of the fact that compelled, in spite of their fear. When Elias lifted his look toward the sacrificial table, the cleric vacillated in his sermon words, slipping uncertainly from his lips, as in spite of the fact that his voice itself was weighed down by the nearness of the child. Some villagers claimed that the church chimes rang unusually on the days Elias gone to benefit their tones, gloomy and overwhelming, not clear as they ought to be. Others swore the incense smoke bended unnaturally, floating in spirals around the boy sometime recently, rising upward as if carried by undetectable hands. Such things seemed not be demonstrated. However, they were rehashed regularly, sufficient to end up truth in the minds of the dreadful townsfolk. The whispers turned to evasion, and shirking turned to open, threatening vibe. Entryways closed when the Finch family strolled past. In the advertised, voices fell quiet when Elias showed up. The children of Ashbourne taunted him behind his back, calling him Phantom Boy or Changeling, in spite of the fact that none challenged insult him to his confront, for his consistent look startled them into hush. Grown-ups talked more obscurely in the bar, recommending that maybe the cleric ought to intercede more immovably, that maybe the town might not chance taking off such a child to develop unchecked. The cleric battled secretly in his confidence. He composed in his diary that Elias appeared both blameless and perilous. A child who had done nothing, however, carried with him a nearness, that made the noble tremble. He counseled the Finches to supplicate to stay enduring, but his eyes taken after the boy with fear. Each time he saw him, he dreaded he was seeing a sign, a test, or maybe a caution, and in spite of the fact that he never talked it out loud, he pondered if Elias was implied to bring salvation or ruin. For Elias himself, none of the whispers mattered. He remained as he continuously had calm, careful tuning in more than talking. He appeared untouched by the disdain of the villagers. However, his quiet, as it were, developed their fear, for what kind of child remained unaffected by contempt? What kind of boy might walk among antagonistic vibe without breaking, without sobbing, without outrage to them? He was not a child, at all, but a figure of sign and nearness that unsettled the arrange of their little world. And so the rumors thickened like storm clouds gathering over Ashbourne, and with each story, with each panicked look, the boy developed advance from the world of men until he stood half in their town and half in something past their understanding, a figure of pale stillness, who bowed moonlight, who hushed supplications, who made confidence vacillate with a single "See Elias Finch at 7, a long-time ancient," was no longer basically a boy. He was a puzzle whispered in each corner of Ashbourne, a shadow that lingered over each heart, and a fear that no science and no sermon may calm. Dr. Harrington returned with individual researchers decided to reveal truth. They endeavored safe tests, sparkling lights through crystals close Elias, but the light bowed in chaotic ways. They set magnets close him, however they flipped brutally as, in spite of the fact that repulsed, he never stood up to. He, as it were, observed with those pale, consistent eyes, as if he, as of now, knew what the comes about would be when the doctor, to begin with, brought his colleagues from London and Oxford. The villagers accumulated exterior. The Finch cultivate whispering with both fear and interest. For Ashbourne had never some time recently seen men of learning arrive with their fine coats, their overwhelming books, and their disobedient pressed carefully. In cleaned wooden cases they talked with specialist, and certainty persuaded that anything encompassed Elias may be charted, measured, and clarified by characteristic law. They started with the least complex tests, setting lights upon the table and directing the bars through glass crystals cut at exact points. They anticipated the commonplace rainbow to scramble upon the divider. However, in Elias's nearness, the colors bent in chaotic shapes. Some of the time the light bowed strongly sideways. In some cases it spiraled like smoke, and once the rainbow appeared to disappear, completely supplanted by a dim silver gleam that beat faintly, like the cadence of a heart. The researchers recorded each flash, their plumes scratching irately upon their diaries, but their faces developed pale for the marvels, denied to rehash in any reliable way, as if the boy himself decided the outcome. Next, they turned to magnets, finely made needles suspended upon silk strings planned to degree the subtlest impact of soil and press. However, when these were brought close, Elias, the needles writhed, turning brutally, as in spite of the fact that seized by imperceptible storms, a few flew from their strings and clattered against the dividers, as in spite of the fact that repulsed with unnatural constraint, Elias did not recoil. He sat calm, his hands collapsed, his eyes relentless, as if the rough response was nothing more than anticipated. The men murmured anxiously around him, one proposing covered up apparatus, another proposing guile. But as they looked the farmhouse, they found nothing. No wires, no gadgets, no apparatuses. As it were, the boy and his silence. Frustration blended with fear as they brought thermometers, indicators, and finely tuned clocks. Each one floundered, as in spite of the fact that the boy's nearness unraveled the strings of their certainty. Mercury columns solidified, at that point bubbled without warm glass. Split along spiked lines, the indicator needle swung between extremes, as in spite of the fact that the exceptionally discussed misplaced its adjust. Indeed, the clocks deceived them. A few moderated to a slither, Their ticking extended and sad, whereas others jumped forward, dashing through the hours without cause. The men contended heatedly, a few claiming their rebellious were defective, others demanding the boy himself was the source. However, none may deny the proof. Sometime recently their eyes, Elias never dissented, never inquired what they looked for. He essentially watched with his pale, unblinking eyes, and when one of the more youthful researchers inclined near, whispering in doubt that the child appeared to expect each result, Elias turned his head somewhat and in a delicate voice rehashed the man's correct words in spite of the fact that no one else had listened them clearly. The bunch drawn back in unease, the more youthful man pale and trembling, dropping his right to the floor, his hands shaking so brutally that he may not recover it until another stooped to help Dr. Harrington, be that as it may, squeezed on his fixation, extending with each disappointment or maybe then startling him. The difficulty of Elias appeared to kindle his starvation for answers. He talked of characteristic logic, of unfamiliar strengths, of a unused science holding up to be born. He told his colleagues that centuries prior, men had snickered at the idea of power or attraction. However, those undetectable powers had been uncovered in time. Maybe Elias, as well, was the proclaim of a few more prominent truth. The others were not so certain. A few mumbled that no science might clarify what had a place to divination. Others denied to meet the boy's look at all, clearing out the room at whatever point. His eyes turned toward them. As the days passed, their tests developed bolder. They put bowls of water. Sometime recently, him observing Swell's shape without touch. They attempted to degree his breath, but the discuss around him moved unusually so that no steady readings might be taken. They indeed endeavored to put metal close his skin. However, the metal trembled and developed warm. Sometime recently, contact might be made. One night, a light burst into fire. Unmerited, its glass shattering over the table, diffusing shards into the scholar's hands. However, Elias sat unharmed, untouched, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, as if it was no more astounding to him than the sunrise. The villagers, observing from a remote place, developed anxious. They saw the researchers carry broken, disobedient from the farmhouse. They listened their raised voices at night, and they whispered that indeed men of information had been lowered by the boy. A few demanded that the researchers would escape in. Fear taking off the Finch family reviled, and alone others accepted. They would take the child absent to mystery research facilities covered up from the eyes of the church, and the crown rumors duplicated until each bar story painted Elias as either the fate of mankind or its covered-up salvation. Meanwhile, the Finch guardians lived in anguish. The mother, torn between help that learned men might at last clarify her child and fear that they would name him unholy or tremendous. The father developed, cold and quiet, his hands unpleasant from anxious work in the areas, unwilling to talk of the men in his domestic, however incapable to deny the fear that clung to him at whatever point he saw his most youthful child encompassed by plumes and lights and smashed glass. He now and then pondered if Elias genuinely had a place to them, if the storm that birthed him had put upon their family a burden no man may bear. The tests proceeded, however, yielded nothing certain, and after weeks the researchers started to break a few, cleared out in outrage, their notes filled with inconsistencies, their pride injured past repair. Others waited, compelled in spite of their fear, incapable to turn absent from the boy who broke their disobedient with nothing more than his nearness through it all. Elias remained quiet, calm, his look unflinching, as in spite of the fact that he, as of now, knew the worthlessness of their endeavors, as in spite of the fact that each result was composed inside him some time. Recently they had indeed begun, and so Dr. Harrington and his colleagues came to get at what the villagers had whispered all along, that Elias Finch was not a stone to be unraveled by crystals and magnets and clocks, but something that opposed the exceptionally laws upon which their science stood, and in spite of the fact that Harrington's fixation, as it were, extended, His colleagues carried domestic not disclosure but fear, whispering in their diaries and to their peers of the pale boy in Ashbourne whose hush unmade the certainty of reason, and whose unfaltering eyes appeared to see, not as it were their disappointments, but the delicate limits of mankind itself. One harvest-time evening, Elias collapsed without caution, his delicate body trembling with such savagery that the exceptionally furniture of the Finch farmhouse shaken and squeaked as if a few imperceptible constrain shook the divider's specialists were summoned in scurry jogging through the sloppy paths, their lights influencing in the thickening sunset. But indeed, when they accumulated around his little outline, none may clarify what they seen. His skin turned cold at that point, hot his eyes, shuddered and rolled upward, and in spite of the fact that they squeezed hands upon him, checked his beat and mumbled in disarray, nothing in their information advertised an answer. The Finch guardians clung to each other in fear, the mother crying, supplications out loud, her rosary dots clattering in her trembling hands, whereas the father paced like a cornered creature torn between confidence in the specialists and lose hope that no medication might repair anything tormented his child. And, at that point in the middle of his rough trembling, Elias talked words, clear and cold words that none who listened them would ever disregard. He whispered, "They need me back sometime recently." His lips fell quiet, his body slack, his breath black out, as in spite of the fact that each word had torn something from inside him. The room solidified. The doctors gazed wide, peered toward their rebellious trembling in their hands. One of them dropped a stethoscope upon the wooden floor where it rolled, and came to rest against the divider. No one moved for a long minute until the mother tossed herself over her child, clutching him so firmly that her cries resounded through the house. "They need me back." She rehashed the words as if attempting to snatch meaning from them, back from where, back to whom, no one may reply. However, in their quiet fear took root. Outside a storm rose, as in spite of the fact that summoned by his words, dark clouds rolling over Ashbourne with unnatural speed, thunder, broken so brutally that the soil itself appeared to tremble underneath the farmhouse. The disgust developed overwhelming, and electric windows shaken upon their outlines, and a moo groan of wind squeezed against the roof. Villagers looked from their windows over the fields, observing the storm accumulate over the Finch arrive, whispering that this was no conventional climate, but a sign that the boy had talked. True lightning cut the sky, lighting up the farmhouse once more and once more. The specialist's interior worked hotly, rubbing Elias's chest, squeezing herbs to his lips, checking for breath, but each exertion vacillated. His skin gleamed pale in each streak of light, as in spite of the fact that the storm itself had claimed him. One man swore that when he inclined near to tune in for breath, he listened, not hush but swoon, whispers, not words he caught on, but a refrain of mumbles resounding like far-off voices carried on the wind. He drawn back, crossing himself in freeze, and denying to go close the boy again. The Finch father requested answers, beating his clenched hands upon the table, his voice breaking in seethe. However, the specialists advertised nothing, as it were stammers of perplexity and fear. Elias remained, still, his breath shallow, his eyes closed, but his confront unusually calm, as in spite of the fact that he was not enduring, but tuning in to something past the reach of mortal ears. Each time thunder shook the dividers, his fingers jerked somewhat, twisting and uncurling, as in spite of the fact that resounding the beat of the storm. The villagers accumulated close the edges of the Finch arrive, clutching cloaks against the rain, a few carrying lights that sputtered and darkened in the unnatural wind. They contended in quieted tones, a few demanding they must offer assistance, others requesting they remain absent, or they as well be drawn into anything. Revile had claimed the boy. One lady swore she saw shapes inside the storm-dim figures, writhing in the clouds like bodies bending in torment or celebration. Another swore. She listened. A title whispered on the thunder in spite of the fact that she seemed not say whose it was. Within the farmhouse, the cleric arrived, soaked in rain, clutching his sacred book. He constrained his way interior and stood over Elias, raising his trembling hands in supplication. His voice shook as he called upon Paradise to cast absent the obscurity. However, his eyes deceived his question. His words vacillated. When the storm replied with thunder so uproarious it suffocated his supplications. Still he continued sprinkling heavenly water upon the boy, upon the bed, upon the dividers. The beads murmured against the discuss, as in spite of the fact that striking inconspicuous blazes, however, Elias did not stir, and at that point, as all of a sudden as it started, the trembling ceased. His body stilled, his breathing developed profound and consistent. The storm exterior moderated in spite of the fact that it did not disappear. The thunder relaxed to a moo roll that reverberated over the slopes. The specialist ventured back in wonder, a few murmuring that they had seen a wonder, others demanding that nothing had changed at all, that the boy remained. The same puzzle untouched by their hands. The mother clutched him, whispering much obliged through tears, in spite of the fact that her words carried the delicate tone of trust, not certainty, but the express weighted upon each tongue. They need me back. No. One seemed shake it. The specialists traded apprehensive looks, unwilling to record it in their diaries, however incapable to disregard the clarity with which it had been talked. The cleric composed it in his journal, that exceptionally night depicting it as the expression of a soul caught between universes, questionable whether it had a place to soil or something passed in the bar. Men contended over its meaning. A few said devils had come to claim him. Others said blessed messengers had talked through him. Still others said it was the voice of the dead calling him home. The days that taken after were filled with pressure. Elias got up frail but lively. However, he talked small of what he had felt. He replied no questions when squeezed, his eyes, as it were, turned toward the sky, as in spite of the fact that tuning in still the villagers developed fretful, maintaining a strategic distance from the Finch, cultivate more than ever, persuaded presently that Elias was not only bizarre but chosen, taken, checked by powers that none of them may title. A few whispered that the storm had been a caution. Others said it was, as it were, the beginning. For the Finch guardians, each minute got to be a torment. Each time Elias closed his eyes, they dreaded he would not wake. Each time thunder sounded in the separate. Their hearts seized with fear, they clung to their child. However, felt him slipping, assist, absent, not in body, but in soul, as in spite of the fact that portion of him, as of now, had a place to the storm, to the voices that called to him. They needed their boy, but he was not completely theirs. He had never been. And so the night Elias collapsed got to be legend in Ashbourne, a story rehashed in quieted voices by firelight. Night. When the boy science might not clarify, talked words that quieted specialists, clerics and guardians alike. A night when the sky themselves thundered in reply. A night that checked the Finch family until the end of time and cast upon Elias the shadow of a truth that none might title. However, all may feel approaching over them like the storm clouds that never completely cleared out the sky. In the middle of the storm, Elias stirred with an interesting calmness, not at all like anything that had passed some time recently. His body no longer powerless, no longer trembling, but composed, as in spite of the fact that the wrath of the skies had steadied or maybe then smashed him, he rose from his bed noiselessly, whereas the doctors contended in unhinged voices, and his mother squeezed her moist confront into her hands when he stood by the farmhouse entryway, no one taken note at. To begin with, until the wind squeezed difficult against the wooden pillars, rattling pivots and drawing each eye toward the child who appeared inconceivably unmoved. The storm seethed past. However, inside its viciousness there was a range and mysterious, Design the winds no longer scattered in wild hurricanes, but circled around the farmhouse in Ponderbeat. As if taking after concealed plan, the covered roof ought to have torn. Absent, however, it held firm, the trees bowed moo. However, did not break. Villagers who braved the slope swore afterward that the clouds over the Finch arrive turned into a tremendous winding gleaming faintly, as in spite of the fact that lit from inside by a few unnatural light, and at its center stood Elias Little, and pale, however brilliant in a way that made developed men drop to their knees. Those who observed from the edge of the areas claimed the disgust developed overwhelming, so that breathing itself felt like breathing in smoke, in spite of the fact that no fire burned. The sound of thunder ceased, supplanted by a moo murmur, profound and thunderous, carrying through the soil, like the voice of something more seasoned than time. Lights diminished over the town. Creatures cried out and broke their ties. Steeds raised against their handlers. Pooches whimpered and pulled. Absent cattle stamped and groaned. The storm had gotten to be more than climate. It was nearness, and at its heart stood a boy no more than 7. A long time in appearance, in spite of the fact that his eyes carried the weight of centuries. Inside the farmhouse, the Finch guardians come to for their child, the father yelling over the wind in spite of the fact that his words were gulped, the mother crying his title in spite of the fact that he did not turn to them. The cleric raised his book and called for paradise. However, his voice split in fear, for he as well saw that Elias was no longer only a child, no longer completely their claim. When the boy lifted his hand toward the storm, the winds bowed to him, twirling more tightly, drawing each free scrap of soil and straw into a circle, almost his feet. The exceptionally discuss appeared to twist, light-bent shadows extended, and in the spin of components, Elias stood unshaken. Then came the light, sudden and blinding, tearing the night into pieces, as, in spite of the fact that the sky had been cleaved open, a column of brilliance plummeted upon the Finch, arrive white, however tinged with silver, so seriously that villagers protected their eyes, falling back into the mud, clutching their lights like toys against the endless obscure. They swore afterward that it was not lightning, for no thunder taken after no spiked streak part the sky in step it held, consistent, a culminate column coming to from soil to cloud, encasing the boy inside its gleam. In that minute quiet fell, so significant that the rain itself appeared to stop, beads hanging suspended in the discuss like globules of glass solidified. Mid-fall within the column, Elias turned his look upon those who observed, in spite of the fact that none seemed meet his eyes. A few swore they saw him grin faintly. Others said his lips moved in words as well, delicate to listen, a goodbye or a favoring, or maybe not one or the other at that point, without a cry, without a battle, without a follow of torment. Elias vanished sometime recently. Their eyes one moment display the following, broken down into the brilliance that gulped him entirety. When the light pulled back in one last surge, it cleared out behind nothing but burned soil, darkened in a culminate circle at the farmhouse edge, as if stamped by fire, in spite of the fact that no fire had touched it. The storm broke with that minute. Clouds scattered, winds fell noiseless. The rain ceased so abruptly that the drops clinging to the villagers' hair and cloaks got to be the final that would drop. That night stars flickered alert over the sky, as if nothing had happened. The arrive lay still, however. Inside that stillness lived a fear more profound than any storm, for in spite of the fact that the storm had gone, it had taken with it the boy who had been both puzzle and burden. The Finch mother collapsed upon the burned soil, tearing at the soil with her hands, crying his title over and over. The father stood inflexible, his confront carved in stun, his body trembling in spite of the fact that he would not drop. The cleric whispered broken supplications, dubious whether to thank paradise for deliverance or revile the powers that had stolen the child. The doctors assembled there, smashed, disobedient and quiet, unwilling to record what they had seen, frightful that indeed the act of composing might summon it back. Villagers as well carried the hush with them, returning to their houses and hearths incapable to talk over a whisper. None sang in the bar that night. No chuckling rose, no clinking of glasses, as it were the moo-mumble of voices rehashing what they had seen. A few said Elias had been claimed by blessed messengers. Others said by devils. Others by strengths past either paradise or hell. One man swore he saw shadows inside the column. Not of wings, but of figures tall and vague coming to for the boy, as in spite of the fact that recovering their claim what they needed, none challenged imagine. In the days that taken after the burned soil remained, no grass developed upon it, no weeds, no greenery. The circle stood dark and uncovered through rain, through ice, through spring defrosting. It was said that fowls would not fly over it, that creatures veered wide around it, that children who meandered close fell sick with fever for evenings. A while later the Finch farmhouse developed calm, its windows covered its chimney smoke. Uncommon, the family emptied by misfortune. The mother matured in weeks. Her hair streaked white. The father pulled back to his areas, working in hush until his hands drained, and the soil gulped his tears. Ashbourne itself never overlooked the night of the storm. The townsfolk carried the memory like a wound. A few maintained a strategic distance from talking of it totally. Others retold it unendingly, forming it into legend, into caution. Travelers passing through listened the story in quieted voices by firelight. The boy who vanished into light, taking off behind quiet and seared soil. A few rejected it as superstition. However, none who strolled the fields at night challenged. Wait close. The Finch arrived, for, indeed, a long time afterward the circle remained untouched by time, and inside its boundary, no sound appeared to carry. No resound returned to the ear. It was as in spite of the fact that the hush itself was alive. And so Elias Finch passed from the world. Not in passing, not in burial, but in vanishing, his destiny. Obscure his words. They need me back, carved until the end of time, into the memory of those who had listened to them, clearing out Ashbourne to ponder who they were, and whether one day they might come once more. Dr. Harrington went through his life composing papers in spite of the fact that none were acknowledged by the Regal Society, for his colleagues expelled his accounts as superstition or franticness. However, he might not rest. He filled whole diaries with outlines of the farmhouse, charts of disobedient that had fizzled, and perpetual portrayals of the light that had devoured Elias Finch. He talked at social occasions where learned men snickered him down. He composed letters to clerics in space, experts to logicians and doctors, all of whom returned hush or respectful dismissal still. He continued, driven not by notoriety or honor, but by the frequenting certainty that what he had seen was genuine, and that the world had no dialect to contain it in his ponders. Harrington developed thin and pale, as in spite of the fact that the boy had stolen a degree of his imperativeness. He meandered the fields at night, carrying lights that glinted and darkened at whatever point he drew close. The Finch cultivate. He collected soil from the seared circle, put it in containers, tried it in his chamber, with warm, with water, with acids. However, nothing modified it. Nothing developed in it. It remained until the end of time, desolate, dark, and overwhelming, with a fragrance like press and smoke. When he rested, he envisioned of the boy standing in the column of light, calling to him without sound. And when he woke, he composed page after page of words that no distributor would set out print. The Finch family never recuperated. The mother squandered into slightness, her eyes empty with despondency, her hair white as snow. She talked to no one, spare the periodic cleric, and indeed at that point her words were scattered, mutterings approximately her child. Almost the voices that needed him back, almost the storm that had come for him. She meandered at times into the areas unshod and sobbing. Her lean outline bowed against the wind. The father persevered longer, but he as well shriveled beneath the weight of hush. He worked his areas until his body gave out one morning, and he was found collapsed close to the plow. The lines of soil around him checked by tears, or maybe then seed in time. The cultivate developed purge, its windows covered, its entryways banished by tidy. The arrive cleared out untilled. No children's giggling, no creatures touching the roof. Drooped beneath rain, the stone dividers broken with ice. Ivy crawled over the stones, as in spite of the fact that nature itself looked for to recover what man had deserted. However, the circle of burned soil remained untouched, disobedient against time. No weed developed upon it, no greenery, no edge of grass. Its edges sharp as if drawn by a few infinite hand-travelers, who strayed as well. Close detailed the stillness that clung to it, the hush that gulped each stride, each breath their claim, pulse ringing louder in their ears until fear drove them away. The story of Elias got to be legend and Ashbourne told to begin, with as truth at that point as rumor at that point as myth. However, it never blurred for children, challenged one another to crawl up the slope to walk past the destroyed farmhouse at night, lights in hand. Their chuckling constrained their voices, trembling. They swore that their lights darkened with each step closer, that their observes moderated. Their clocks ticked unevenly. A few claimed they listened whispers in the dim, others that they saw a pale figure in the window observing them with eyes as well unfaltering as well knowing. And when they fled back into town breathless, their lights flared, shinning once more, and their clocks returned to their appropriate rhythm. For decades the story persevered. The boy who science seemed not clarify. The boy who vanished in a storm of light. Moms utilized his title to calm their children, caution them not to meander as well distant onto the fields, for fear that Elias take them back with him. Ancient men in bars told travelers that the boy had been claimed by blessed messengers or evil spirits or guests from past the stars. No two accounts the same. However, all carried the same chill, for each man in Ashbourne knew that the seared soil remained, that the farmhouse still stood in destroy, and that the hush never lifted from the place. Dr. Harrington developed more seasoned, however, never ceased his look, his house filled with books and maps, his dividers lined with outlines of spirals of storms, of lights slipping from the clouds, his diaries stacked tall upon the floor, ink blotched with restless hands. He talked to less and less individuals until at final he vanished himself a few. Said he kicked the bucket in his domestic others. Whispered he strolled into the Finch cultivate, circle on a moonless night, never to rise once more in the morning. His house stood quiet, his papers scattered, as in spite of the fact that lifted by a wind that had carried them somewhere else, the illustrious society did not check his passing. Ashbourne did not grieve, however. A few villagers swore the hush around the cultivate developed more profound. After his disappearance, generations passed, the mine shafts closed. The town developed, poorer children cleared out for the cities. The story of Elias remained one of the few things that bound Ashbourne together, whispered around hearths and carried into classrooms where instructors cautioned of superstition, in spite of the fact that their claim voices trembled when storms rolled in. Over the fields, travelers passing through now and then sneered at the story. However, none who challenged to visit the cultivate at night waited long, for their lights darkened, their observes moderated, and they felt eyes upon them, eyes relentless and unblinking, observing from the dark. And so the boy who science may not clarify remained a wound upon the arrive, his non-appearance more display than his life, his hush more enduring than any word. And in Ashbourne to this day, the farmhouse stands. Demolished, the circle lies fruitless, and the legend holds up for those who would test its truth.